The host, Evan Carter, young and ambitious, with impeccable hair and a self-assured smile, clutched his tablet with notes. His voice was smooth as polished glass, but carried a hint of challenge. "Mr. Redford," he began, "you're a Hollywood legend, but tonight we want to talk about something current. The new Pope, Leo XIV, the first American in that role. What do you think of him?" The question hung in the air like the first rumble of thunder before a storm. A hush fell over the studio, broken only by the faint hum of cameras. The audience, many of whom remembered a time when the Vatican seemed distant and untouchable, awaited his response. But backstage, the producer, a young woman in headphones, nervously gripped her tablet. She knew Evan wasn't just asking a question. He was throwing down a gauntlet. Leo XIV, Robert Francis Prevost, elected on May 8, 2025, was not only the first American pope, but a figure sparking heated debates with his bold statements on social justice and condemnation of imperialism, particularly Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Robert Redford leaned forward, his blue eyes narrowing, though his face remained calm. "Leo XIV, he repeated, his voice low, with a slight rasp that lent weight to each word. "I respect a man who isn't afraid to call things what they are. He speaks of justice, of protecting those who are ignored. He condemned the war in Ukraine as imperialist aggression, and that's not just words, it's a stance. The world needs such voices, especially in an era where truth often hides behind flashy headlines." The audience erupted in applause. A woman in the front row, with gray hair and tired eyes, clutched her purse tightly. Her son volunteered in a humanitarian mission, and Redford's words about justice resonated with her own pain. But Evan Carter only smiled wider, his eyes glinting. "Interesting," he said, cutting through the applause. "But don't you think Leo XIV is a bit radical? His statements about artificial intelligence as a threat to human dignity, his critique of capitalism, that's not exactly the American way, is it?" The tension in the studio thickened. A few audience members exchanged glances, sensing how Evan's question struck a nerve. For many older Americans who grew up in the era of the Cold War and economic prosperity, the Pope's radical ideas challenged their values. Yet for others, who had seen their pensions dwindle due to corporate greed and their children struggle with automation, Leo XIV's words were a breath of fresh air. Robert didn't look away from the host. His fingers, resting on the armrest of his chair, tightened almost imperceptibly. "Radical?" he asked, his voice quiet but piercing, like the wind before a storm. "Calling out injustice isn't radical, Evan. It's honesty. Leo XIV says that technology, like wealth, should serve people, not the other way around. You think that's un-American? I think it's exactly what we fought for. A country where every voice matters, not just those holding the purse strings." The applause rolled through the room again, but this time it carried something more. Not just support, but a sense that Redford was speaking for everyone who had been underestimated because of their age, experience, or ideals. Evan, sensing he was losing control, leaned forward. "Those are fine words," he said, his tone sharper now. "But let's be honest, Mr. Redford. You're a Hollywood star, a man of privilege. Can you really understand what the Pope is talking about? Or is this just a performance?" The silence in the studio turned oppressive. The question was a blow, not just to Redford, but to the audience, who felt their own experiences and values belittled. Robert narrowed his eyes, but his face remained impassive. He knew this wasn't just an interview, it was a battle, for truth, for dignity, for the right to be heard. Have you ever felt your experience or values were dismissed because of your age? Share in the comments how you would have responded in Robert Redford's place when accused of being out of touch with reality. The Manhattan studio buzzed with tension, like a scene poised before the climax of a Hollywood thriller. The spotlight's glare reflected off the glass walls, creating the illusion of a cage where every move Robert Redford made was captured by the cameras. His calm demeanor, faded denim shirt, hands resting casually on the armrests, contrasted with the predatory energy of the host, Evan Carter. The audience, mostly people over 50, sat transfixed, no longer mere spectators but witnesses to something greater. Redford's words about Pope Leo XIV, the first American pope, still echoed in their ears. Calling out injustice isn't radical, it's honesty. Evan Carter, sensing he was losing the upper hand, shifted tactics. His smile grew sharper, his voice laced with subtle irony. "Mr. Redford," he said, fingers tapping his tablet, "you talk about honesty, but let's look at Pope Leo XIV from another angle. He criticizes artificial intelligence, calling it a threat to human dignity. Don't you think that's a bit out of touch? We live in an era of technology where AI helps doctors, engineers, even actors. Isn't his stance a step backward? The outdated view of someone who doesn't understand the modern world?" The question struck like lightning. A low murmur rippled through the audience. For many in this crowd, who remembered when computers filled entire rooms, technology was both a marvel and a threat. Their children had lost jobs to automation, and their grandchildren spent hours glued to screens, forgetting face-to-face connection. Evan's words hit a sore spot, but they also carried a challenge. Were the Pope, and by extension Redford, stuck in the past? Robert narrowed his eyes, his face impassive, but a faint smile flickered at the corners of his mouth. He leaned back in his chair, like a hunter assessing a trap. "Evan," he began, his voice quiet but cutting through the studio like a canyon breeze. "You think technology is just a tool? Leo XIV isn't against progress. He's talking about what happens when AI, unchecked, erodes what makes us human: dignity, compassion, justice. Have you ever considered what happens when machines decide who gets a job and who doesn't? Who gets healthcare and who's left behind?" The audience erupted in applause. A man in the third row, with weathered hands and a faded cap, nodded, his eyes gleaming. He'd lost his factory job to automation, and Redford's words hit home. But Evan didn't back down. He leaned forward, his voice sharper, almost aggressive. "That's all very poetic," he said. "But Leo XIV also criticized U.S. policy, particularly on migrants. Do you support him there? Don't you think as an American he should be more loyal to his country?" The studio froze. The question was a landmine, ready to explode. Backstage, the producer, a young woman in headphones, clenched her fists. She knew Evan was pushing the boundaries, trying to provoke Redford into a misstep that could dominate tomorrow's headlines. But Robert didn't rush. He stood slowly from his chair, ignoring the surprised murmurs from the audience. The camera zoomed in, capturing every move. "Loyalty, Evan?" His voice was low but carried a weight that silenced the room. "Loyalty isn't blind worship. Leo XIV talks about migrants because he's seen their struggles. He lived in Peru, worked with those driven from their homes. I respect him for that because he doesn't hide behind pretty words. He challenges a system that ignores human pain for political points. And you, Evan, when was the last time you looked into the eyes of someone who's lost everything? Does your microphone give you the right to judge those trying to make the world better?" The applause roared through the room like a wave. The woman in the front row with gray hair and tired eyes raised her hand as if to support him. Her son, a volunteer in a humanitarian mission, had told her about the suffering of migrants, and Redford's words echoed her own thoughts. Evan tried to regain control, but his voice drowned in the noise. "Mr. Redford," he began, only to be interrupted by another wave of applause. Backstage, the producer received a message from the network. "Cut the segment if he gets out of control." But it was too late. Robert Redford wasn't just answering questions. He was throwing down a challenge, not just to Evan, but to the entire system that used media to divide rather than unite. "What do you think of Pope Leo XIV's stance on artificial intelligence and migrants? Do you believe technology could threaten human dignity, as the Pope suggests? Or is it fair to criticize one's own country's policies, as Leo XIV does?" Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us how you would respond to Evan Carter in Redford's place. The Manhattan studio crackled with tension, like an arena before a decisive blow. The spotlight's glare blinded the eyes, but Robert Redford stood unshaken, his presence, faded denim shirt, gray hair, calm but vigilant gaze, radiating a strength that held the audience spellbound. Evan Carter, the host with a predatory smile, felt control slipping through his fingers. The applause following Redford's response about Pope Leo XIV still reverberated through the room, and social media backstage was already exploding with the hashtag #ArcherRedfordSpeaks. The audience, mostly people over 50 who had grown up on his films, saw him not just as a star but as the voice of their generation, a generation the modern world often dismissed as outdated. Evan, his tablet trembling in his hands, decided to go all in. His voice, sharp as a blade, cut through the silence. Mr. Redford, you talk about justice, about dignity. But let's dig deeper. Leo XIV calls for radical reforms. He wants the church to sell its treasures to help the poor. Do you support that? Don't you think it's a utopian idea that could destroy an institution that's shaped the world's moral compass for centuries? The question landed like a detonation. A low hum rippled through the audience. People exchanged glances, their faces a mix of awe and unease. For many, the church was not just an institution but a part of their lives. Baptisms, weddings, memories of Sunday masses. Yet they also knew the Vatican's wealth often faced criticism, and Pope Leo XIV's call as an American for such changes forced them to reflect. Could traditions be sacrificed for justice? Robert didn't look away from Evan. His blue eyes, sharp as a mountain lake, seemed almost otherworldly in the spotlight's glow. He rose slowly, ignoring the surprised whispers from the audience, and stepped toward the edge of the stage. The camera zoomed in, capturing every move, while the producer backstage clenched her fists, knowing this moment could change everything. Evan, Redford began, his voice low but piercing, like a bell in the silence. You ask if I support the Pope's idea to sell the church's treasures? Let me tell you this. Wealth isn't gold or paintings. True wealth is the trust of people. Leo XIV wants to restore that trust by putting the poor and marginalized at the center. If that means parting with a few relics to feed the hungry, then I say, why not? And you, Evan, what would you sacrifice for those who have no voice? The room erupted in applause so loud the camera operator flinched. The woman in the front row, with gray hair and tired eyes, stood from her seat, her hands trembling with emotion. She remembered her family's struggles after losing their jobs to corporate greed, and Redford's words were like a lifeline. But Evan didn't relent. He sensed he was losing the audience, and his voice grew sharper, almost desperate. That's all very noble, he said. But Leo XIV also condemned the war in Ukraine as imperialist aggression. Don't you think, as an American, he should be more cautious with his words? Doesn't he risk dividing the global community when we need unity? Robert smiled, a thin, almost imperceptible smile that recalled his Western heroes. He turned to the audience, his gaze sweeping over their faces. Wrinkles, weariness, hope. Leo XIV speaks the truth, he said, his voice calm but carrying a force that could move mountains. He calls the war what it is, an injustice that destroys lives. You think truth divides? I think truth unites. It gives people a chance to stand up and say, enough. And you, Evan, when was the last time you said enough to something you knew was wrong? Or does your microphone only amplify noise? The applause rolled through the room like a tidal wave. A man in the third row, wearing a faded cap, clenched his fists, his eyes gleaming. He remembered his son returning from a volunteer mission in Ukraine, recounting stories of ruined cities and human suffering. Redford's words weren't just a response, they were a call to action. Evan, sensing defeat, threw out another question, his voice trembling with barely concealed anger. Mr. Redford, Leo XIV also calls for rethinking the role of women in the church. Do you support that? Don't you think it could undermine traditions that have held the church together for centuries? Robert didn't hesitate. He turned back to Evan, his gaze sharp but calm. Traditions, he asked. Traditions should serve people, not the other way around. Leo XIV talks about women because he sees their strength, their wisdom. I grew up in a world where women were underestimated, and I've seen them change that world, often without a microphone or a stage. If the Pope wants to give them a voice, I say, it's about time. And you, Evan, why are you afraid of change? Or is it more comfortable when everything stays the same? The audience erupted in applause that refused to die down. People rose from their seats, their faces glowing with pride and anger. The producer backstage received a message from the network. Cut him off now. But it was too late. Robert Redford wasn't just answering questions. He was dismantling a system, and the audience felt he was speaking for them. His words about Leo XIV, about justice, about dignity, were not just responses. They were a manifesto. Which of Evan Carter's questions struck you as the most provocative? Would you support Pope Leo XIV's stance on selling the church's treasures, condemning war, or expanding women's roles? Share in the comments how you would respond in Redford's place and tell us what inspires you about his words.